So let's start at the beginning, because you have to start at the beginning to see how we got here. What is a tariff, really? It sounds complicated, it sounds like something you'd need an economics degree to understand, but it isn't, not really. A tariff is just a tax. It's a tax on things that come into our country from other countries. Imagine a ship pulling into a port, say, Los Angeles. Sneakers, televisions, car parts. Before those things can be unloaded and sent to stores, the government says, hold on, you have to pay a tax on that. That tax is the tariff. It makes those imported goods more expensive. Simple. Now, why would a president want to do that? Specifically, why did Donald Trump want to do that? The argument, the one he has made again and again, goes like this. Other countries, especially China, are not playing fair. They are supposedly cheating the system. They are making their products so cheap that American companies can't compete. So American factories close. American workers lose their jobs. The solution, in Mr. Trump's view, is to build a wall. Not a physical wall this time, but a wall of taxes. A tariff wall. By making foreign goods more expensive, he argued, American-made goods would suddenly look a lot more attractive. It was all part of his America First agenda. A plan to bring jobs back, make America the world's manufacturing king once again. And so, the case arrived. It landed on the steps of the highest court in the land, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. The question before them wasn't whether tariffs are good or bad for the economy. That's a political question. No, the question was much more fundamental. It was about the rule of law. It was about the separation of powers. Did the President of the United States have the authority to impose such a monumental economic policy all by himself? Did a decades-old law about national security really give him a blank check to start a global trade war? The nation held its breath. The world watched. The decision, when it came, was a thunderclap. A decisive, nearly unanimous ruling against the president. The court, in a stunning rebuke, found that the Trump administration had massively overstepped its authority. The justices, in their majority opinion, made it crystal clear. The power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts and excises to regulate commerce with foreign nations belongs to Congress. The Constitution is not ambiguous on this point. It is right there in Article 1, Section 8. The court argued that while Congress can delegate some of that authority to the executive branch, it cannot delegate its core constitutional responsibilities away entirely. The majority opinion, penned by the Chief Justice himself, was a masterclass in judicial restraint and constitutional first principles. It explained that the national security law Mr. Trump was using as his justification was never intended for this purpose. It was designed for genuine emergencies. The reaction from the White House was not delayed. It was not measured. It was instantaneous. It was volcanic. The moment the Supreme Court's decision was announced, Donald Trump's social media accounts erupted in a firestorm of fury and disbelief. This wasn't just disagreement, this was a full-blown public meltdown. He declared the decision a treasonous act, and a stab in the back to the American worker. He didn't just attack the ruling, he went after the justices themselves personally. He accused the court of being a political tool for the radical left and the globalist elites, people who, in his words, want to see our country fail. The former president didn't stop there. In a hastily arranged press conference on the lawn of his Mar-a-Lago resort, his anger was palpable. His face was flushed, his words were clipped. He claimed the justices, including those he personally appointed, had betrayed him. "I gave them the seat," he fumed, gesturing wildly, "and they have no loyalty. No loyalty to me, no loyalty to the Constitution, no loyalty to our great country." He called the Supreme Court a joke and a disgrace, suggesting it was populated by political hacks in black robes. He painted himself as a lone warrior, fighting for the common person, only to be thwarted by a corrupt, out-of-touch judiciary. This was not the typical presidential response to a disappointing court ruling. This was a direct assault on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself. Back in Washington, D.C., the reaction on Capitol Hill was as swift as it was predictable. A tale of 2 entirely different realities, a perfect snapshot of our polarized nation. For Democrats, the Supreme Court's decision felt like profound relief and vindication. The Senate Majority Leader strode to microphones and hailed it as a victory for the Constitution and the American people. He praised the court for upholding separation of powers and reining in a dangerous abuse of executive authority. The Speaker of the House called it a landmark day for the rule of law. Across the Democratic caucus, the mood was celebratory. Lawmakers who had warned about Trump's executive power felt validated. They framed it as a win for the system of government. But the other side of the aisle told a different story. Republican reactions mixed muted frustration with defiant loyalty to Donald Trump. Party leadership was in a bind. Publicly criticizing a conservative Supreme Court they helped build was tricky. Many offered carefully worded statements of disappointment. They avoided attacking the justices directly, instead criticizing the outcome. They argued the court misunderstood threats of unfair trade and tied the president's hands, protecting American jobs. The pro-Trump wing followed Trump's lead without hesitation. They rushed to his defense, echoing his outrage and attacks on the judiciary. On social media and conservative outlets, they called it judicial activism and an assault on a patriot president. They accused the court of legislating from the bench. They said the justices sided with globalists over American workers. This split highlighted a central GOP tension: respect for institutions versus unwavering allegiance to one man. For many, loyalty to Trump now superseded loyalty to the constitutional order. Away from the marble halls of Washington, the Supreme Court's decision sent immediate shockwaves through the American economy. On Wall Street, the reaction was, well, instantaneous and overwhelmingly positive. The moment the news broke, the stock market soared. The Dow Jones Industrial Average jumped hundreds of points in a matter of minutes. Why? Because for big business, the tariff plan was a nightmare of uncertainty. It threatened to blow up the intricate global supply chains that companies have spent decades building. It promised higher costs, unpredictable price swings, and the very real possibility of retaliatory tariffs from other countries. For multinational corporations, importers, and retailers, the court's decision was like a storm cloud suddenly vanishing. It meant stability. It meant predictability. Business leaders, who usually try to stay out of political fights, issued cautious but optimistic statements. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce released a statement praising the ruling for providing much-needed clarity and preventing a self-inflicted economic wound. The National Retail Federation said the decision would protect American consumers from crippling price increases on everyday goods. For the world of big finance and global commerce, the striking down of the tariff plan wasn't about politics. It was about the return of a predictable, rules-based system. But what about Main Street? For ordinary Americans, the feelings were far more mixed, far more complicated. In manufacturing towns across the Rust Belt, places where the promise of tariffs resonated most deeply, there was a sense of disappointment and betrayal. For workers who had lost jobs to overseas competition, Trump's tariff plan represented a glimmer of hope. It was a promise that someone was finally fighting for them. To them, the Supreme Court's decision felt like another example of a distant, elite institution siding with big corporations and foreign countries over the American worker. They saw it as the system protecting itself, not protecting them. For most other American consumers, however, the ruling brought a quiet sense of relief, even if they weren't following the news closely. The tariffs would have meant higher prices on, well, almost everything. The Supreme Court's decision effectively prevented a sudden and sharp increase in the cost of living for millions. This decision does more than just stop one specific policy. It sends a massive ripple out across the waters of American politics and global trade. For decades, there has been a slow but steady shift of power in Washington. Congress, often gridlocked and divided, has increasingly delegated its authority on complex issues like trade to the executive branch. This ruling is a powerful pushback against that trend. It is the judicial branch telling the legislative branch, this power is yours. You must use it. You cannot simply give it away to the president. This could force Congress to become more involved in the nitty-gritty of trade policy, a role it has largely abdicated for a generation. The ruling fundamentally alters the landscape for any future president, Democrat, Republican. The playbook of using vague national security claims to justify massive economic actions has been severely weakened. A future president who wants to impose tariffs will now likely have to go through the messy, complicated process of getting a bill through Congress. This makes sweeping unilateral trade wars much less likely. It restores a crucial check on presidential power, forcing a president to build a consensus and negotiate with lawmakers rather than simply issuing a decree. It reinforces the idea that major shifts in national policy should be debated and decided by the people's elected representatives. Globally, the reaction from America's allies was a collective, audible sigh of relief. The Trump tariff plan had terrified leaders in Europe-Asia. So what happens now? What are the next moves on this grand political chessboard? For Donald Trump, being told no by the Supreme Court is not the end of the game. It is simply the start of a new one. His first and most obvious move is to make this a central issue of his political platform. He will use this ruling as fuel for his rallies. as evidence for his claim that the entire system is rigged against him and his supporters. He will campaign on a promise to take back our country from the unelected judges and globalist elites who he claims are selling out the American worker. This is no longer just about tariffs, it's about a populist crusade against the institutions of government themselves. Beyond the campaign trail, Mr. Trump and his allies in Congress have a few potential policy avenues, though they are much more difficult. They could try to pass a new law. They could attempt to write legislation that explicitly grants the president the broad tariff authority the Supreme Court just struck down. This would be a monumental political battle. It would force every member of Congress to go on the record. Do they support giving this much power to the president, or do they believe in Congress's constitutional role? Given the current political divisions, passing such a law would be an uphill climb, but the fight itself would be the point. It would be a way to keep the issue alive and force a national debate. Another more extreme option that has been whispered about in the far corners of the conservative legal world is to challenge the very foundation of the court's authority. This could involve proposals to limit the Supreme Court's jurisdiction over certain issues, or even to ignore the ruling outright, daring the other branches of government to enforce it. This would provoke a genuine constitutional crisis, a direct conflict between the executive and judicial branches. While it sounds unthinkable, Mr. Trump has repeatedly shown a willingness to push boundaries and challenge norms that were once considered sacred. It is a frightening possibility that can no longer be dismissed out of hand. For policymakers in the current administration and in Congress who oppose Mr. Trump's vision, the task is twofold. The shadow cast by this Supreme Court decision will be long and will fall across the entire American political landscape. It has redefined the debate over presidential power. For years it was academic law professors, political theorists. Now it's front and center, real and immediate. How much power should a president have is no longer abstract. The ruling made it a visceral partisan issue, a new litmus test, separating candidates' voters in the elections to come. This decision handed Donald Trump a powerful new grievance fuels his movement. He thrives on being a victim, a fighter for the people under attack by a corrupt establishment. This ruling fits that story. He can point to the 9 justices, including those he appointed, as proof of a deep state conspiracy, a tool to mobilize his base, stoke righteous anger, and persuade them the system must be dismantled and rebuilt in his image. For the Republican Party, this is a deeper internal crisis. The party of Abraham Lincoln, Dwight Eisenhower. Ronald Reagan long saw itself as defender of institutions and the constitutional order, but now its dominant figure is at war with the judiciary. Every Republican must choose: defend the court's legitimacy or stand with their popular leader and join his assault. This is a soul-searching moment that will define the GOP for a generation. So, as the dust settles from this monumental clash between a president and the Supreme Court, we are left standing at a crossroads. This ruling was more than just a legal decision. It was a stress test for the entire American system of government. It revealed the resilience of our institutions and the profound fragility of the norms that hold them together. The court upheld the letter of the law, but the furious reaction showed how much the spirit of that law has decayed. The immediate crisis of the tariff plan is over. The larger constitutional crisis it exposed is just beginning. What should you watch for next? First, watch the rhetoric. Listen to how politicians talk about this decision on the campaign trail. Donald Trump, his Republican allies, are they framing it as a legitimate constitutional check or as an illegitimate political attack? The language they use will tell you about their respect for the rule of law and the future they envision for presidential power. This rhetoric will shape political debate and public opinion, turning a Supreme Court case into a symbol in the culture war. Second, watch Congress. Does this decision jolt lawmakers into action? Will they take back the authority they have given away over the decades? Finally, and most importantly, this is a story whose final chapter has not yet been written, but by the American people. And now, we all have to watch what happens next.